This is episode 4 of season 1 of Babylon 5, Infection. We start with an Interstellar Network news reporter remonstrating with Garibaldi over Sinclair's lack of presence for an interview with her. And Garibaldi explains to her that he's taken off with a star tray, which we saw at the start of the episode, to go and investigate a stricken transport. And she's not impressed. Garibaldi is meanwhile examining a root in his hand and trying to decide whether or not it's an aphrodisiac or in fact floor wax. The reporter goes on to say that it's Babylon 5's second birthday and that Lloyd's of London were 500 to 1 against the station surviving for even 1 year. So she really wants this interview and it's been pre-arranged. She goes off to use the facilities, and interestingly Garibaldi uses a contactless, more or less, I think, method of payment. I think they do actually insert the card into a machine, but I bet it is contactless if they want it to be. So, good foreshadowing for the future there. We then switch to MedLab, and a gentleman called Vance, who is also a man from Uncle, of course, David McCallum, is offering Stephen an adventure. I find him quite hard to watch in this episode. Vance, I mean, not Franklin. I just get the impression that he doesn't really want to be there somehow, but you can watch the episode for yourself and make your own mind up. Add something in the comments. The scene then switches to the cargo bay, where unfortunately the customs guys are really on the ball and spots a hidden compartment in the crates that this guy is asking him to inspect. And this results in him being zerked with something that can only be described as a taser type device. It turns out the chap's name is Nelson, who's doing the zerking, and he leaves him rather unceremoniously strewn on the floor and goes off with his unchecked cargo. In the cargo bay, the body bag is being zipped up after everyone's arrived, and Garibaldi and Sinclair are there and with Franklin. And that's a little bit surprising because it wasn't really apparent from that first few minutes that the bloke was actually dead. But clearly, whatever was used to zerk him, it had no stun setting. So he's dead, and it's just a question now of why it was done and whether or not they can figure out what was done. So we return to MedLab and Franklin coming back in, having dealt with the situation in the cargo bay, and it's revealed that the items which we saw a moment ago in the cargo bay are now in Franklin's MedLab, and they came from a dig on a world called Ikara 7, which is known to be a dead world, and they were sealed in a vault 1 mile down underneath the surface, but someone really didn't want anyone finding them. There's a quick flick to Command and Control Center because there's an energy spike as one of the boxes the artifacts are containing is opened. So we know there's something up with this already. There's something going on here. And it's revealed that an organisation called Interplanetary Expeditions arranged for this archaeological dig off-world, and that the artifacts date from around 1,000 years ago. So Vance encourages Franklin to put one of the artifacts onto his medical scanner to have a look at it. And Franklin is surprised to find that there are various organic elements to this thing, which looks sort of shiny and brand new, despite the fact that it's 1,000 years old. And it's identified as being organic technology, basically. This is very exciting because Earth simply can't do it yet. It's noted that the Vorlons and the Minbari are believed to have some degree of organic ships, but no one's ever really got up close enough to them to make a determination and to learn anything further. Now, Franklin is immediately perturbed by this as a concept because organic items should be in quarantine for a period of time before they can go on to the station. Vance claims that they've been checked at a transfer station off at Proxima 3, and we were told that his associate Nelson, who we saw attacking the customs officer, has sorted all this out and has the paperwork. Franklin just have a look at it. Franklin's still a bit starry-eyed. There is a backstory here in that Vance apparently was his professor, his teacher at some point, although not in medicine. I'm not quite sure why they would have had this association, but I think there are certain elements, things like archaeology and sort of xenobiology and that sort of thing, where they had a bit of crossover, so they do know each other, and that's why Vance has gone to him, because Vance says that he needs someone he can trust, rather than using a lab on Earth to analyse these artefacts. So Franklin agrees to help him, at least in the short term, and Vance asks Nelson to carry on unpacking. And of course, Nelson sees that there is a box, and this is after Franklin and Vance are elsewhere. So as he's unpacking, he notices that there's a little box in amongst the artefacts. And what does he do? He decides to open the box. What an intelligent bloke. So he gets hit by a massive energy discharge as he opens the lid of this box and ends up on the floor. And in the next scene, we see that he's not feeling himself, and that something is happening with his arms. Changes. So this clearly does not bode well. He's being hit with an energy discharge, and now his physical form is being altered. So we can kind of see where this is going, and it's a slightly odd name for the episode. I mean, this is the infection. That's the infection. But you might be able to read a little bit more into that later on as well. So C&C are still investigating the death of the customs officer, and it's still believed at this point that it's natural causes. Bolivar is looking into the energy charges that the command crew identified earlier, and Bolivar takes this opportunity to remind Sinclair about his interview. As it turns out, the reason that he's not massively keen on it is that his last interview did not go well, and ended up with him being posted rather remotely. Garibaldi, however, doesn't see a problem with any of this, because if Sinclair gets kicked off the station, he gets a promotion to commander, for which Sinclair thanks him. Back in Medlab, there's a War of the Worlds reference, in that there's a Martian war machine waiting outside Medlab that would like to have a word with Franklin about common cold. It's a nice touch. It turns out that they've been looking at this stuff for 15 hours straight now. You know, they're probably dying of a break and quite possibly a shower. Franklin has a very earnest discussion with Vance about the whole methodology of what he's doing in terms of going to planets and finding stuff that other people have created rather than trying to create his own stuff. Franklin thinks it's a shortcut. He thinks it's grave robbing, which you can see the point. But Vance says that in a slightly sort of Blade Runner-esque fashion that he's seen stuff that Stephen wouldn't believe, basically. But he says that off-world expeditions aren't cheap, so there has to be this corporate involvement. Stephen's already a bit suspicious at this point, because he says that he's looked into interplanetary expeditions and they don't appear to exist. So presumably he's Googled them, or whatever the then present day equivalent is, and he can't find them. So we know there's a question mark forming beyond the things that we've already seen from a viewer's point of view, which Stephen isn't aware of course. So Garibaldi was trying to hit it off with the ISN reporter, Interstellar Network News reporter. It's referred to as ISN throughout the series, and we hear a little bit about his backstory with Sinclair, which led to him being assigned to the station with him. But the reporter is actually more interested in his own rather troubled employment history, and he basically doesn't engage with her and leaves. Meanwhile, we see that Nelson is more changed than he was before, and that he's helping himself to more elements of the artifacts in order to increase the speed of his change, basically. So Franklin arrives into Medlab, and it would appear that he hasn't put 10p into the electricity meter because the lights won't come on. And fairly shortly after that, Nelson turns up, announces that he's here to protect, and then proceeds to shoot Franklin with his arm, which is turned into a blaster. And Franklin is thrown across the room. As it transpires, he is okay. He's banged up, but he's okay. And he's able to give Garibaldi and Sinclair his best guess about what's going on, in that the armour that was apparently growing on Nelson looked similar to the artefacts that they'd been looking at. Garibaldi is immediately suspicious and asks whether or not the artefacts have been through quarantine, which they're supposed to have been through, and Franklin is only able to tell him what Vance told him, because Garibaldi is immediately not impressed by this as a concept. When they question Vance about it, he seems to know more about the artifacts than he actually told Steve in the first place, because he refers to Nelson perhaps being assimilated by the artifacts because they can't move around by themselves. But he never mentioned that to Stephen, that we saw. So there is a very strong implication that he knows far more than actually he was initially letting on. So we then discover that evil is lurking in Grey 13 sector. It's a question of boom today, because the creature, the alien arm, is basically taking fairly extreme measures to make sure that it's not spotted. So Command and Control pick up this blast, and they note that it's significantly more powerful than the first one that they detected. And when a security guard arrives into the area, he finds that there are shadows of victims on the wall. So basically they've been pretty much nearly vaporized. So back in Command and Control, Sinclair is taking the level of alert higher, and Ivanov is trying to triangulate the position of the alien armour. When the reporter arrives, she gets in between her and Sinclair and implies that unless she wants to experience a great deal of pain for her age, she might be wise to leave the Command and Control Centre, because it's a restricted area, of course, and she very wisely does so. Meanwhile, Nelson is putting on some weight and is now stomping around the grey sector of the station, having really sort of fully transformed into the armour at this point. Garibaldi takes a special weapons and tactics team in, but Nelson basically ignores them and burns through to another level. Their PPGs basically can't touch him, and they can't scan for him through the whole sections that he's moving through until he opens fire again. In MedLab, Franklin and Vance are having some success. They've identified what they believe to be an alien data storage device amongst the artifacts, which might give them some answers. And Franklin also picks up Nelson's taser device that he used to kill the customs guard. Ivanova notes that the armour is using sort of hit and run tactics, but its power level is building up and increasing after each recharge, and it's recharging faster each time. So it's probably getting to the point now where it can actually endanger the station's existence as a whole. She also believes that it's heading for the central corridor, which is heavily populated. So Garibaldi sets about clearing the area and setting up a trap for it. Franklin then arrives to C&C as Sinclair is getting into his sort of riot gear, and we are now told a little bit more about the background behind the artifacts and the armour. So it belongs to the Icarans, as you would expect, and it seems that they'd been invaded a lot in the past, so they developed sort of an ultimate weapon to defend themselves against invaders. And they incorporated brainwaves into it to make it independent. The only difficulty with it is that it only responds to commands from pure Icarans, but the definition of pure left a lot to be desired, and pure was actually defined by sort of religious zealots and very military-minded people. 11 machines were used to defeat the invaders, but they then decided that there were no Icarans sufficiently pure enough around to command them, and because they'd been instructed to kill anyone who wasn't pure, they wiped out the entire population of the planet, having already killed all the invaders as well. And then over the course of time, of course, there was no one to maintain them, so they gradually just stopped functioning. But this one, number 12, of course, is now active, and it's still following its program mission to wipe out anything that is pure Icaran, which is everything on the station. Sinclair and Garibaldi engage it again in the trap, but again the PPGs aren't enough to slow it down, and it burns through the deck beneath it, moving towards the area where the people are being shielded, basically. So Sinclair decides to take the Ripley option. He's gonna try and blow it out into space. So he's going to try and lead it away from the populated areas to a hangar deck and blow it out into space. So he follows it down into the deck where it burns through, and he calls out using his comms device, his link, using a tannoy system, and he calls out for Tular of Ikara 7 because Tular is the guy whose brainwaves are built into it. So he's trying to sort of end run round it and try and get mad enough to follow him and to try and hopefully maybe argue with it. So Sinclair tells him that his name is dead and his world is dead. So he's trying to get through to the personality matrix. Sinclair takes a hit, but presumably the armor wasn't back at full power, and he legs it, and he hopes that the armor will follow him. And it's apparent that it isn't massively intelligent, and it starts stomping after him. So Sinclair manages to get it into the cargo bay as he'd intended, and he has the cargo bay door sealed behind him. And now he rather cleverly plays a bit of a trump card. He says to the armor that it's Nelson, who it's taken over, has been to Ikara, so Tular can access Nelson's memories to confirm that what Sinclair is saying about it being a dead world is true. So Tular does this, and he has to acknowledge the fact that actually, his programming is now irrelevant because the world he was supposed to be defending is dead, nothing left to defend. And at this point, he actually invokes the Great Maker, which is funny because I guess this must be where JMS's online nickname comes from. He's often referred to as the Great Maker online. It used to be referred to that in the news groups back in the day, so that's probably where it comes from. So we get a bit of a Hulk-esque moment now where the Ikaran war machine takes out the sort of beetle-like units that converted it into full power in the first place, rips it out of its chest, and I think actually crushes it as well. So that obviously depowers it. And we cut away to Sinclair shielding his eyes, and when we cut back again, it's like the sun's gotten real low for the Ikaran war machine because it's basically reverted back to a naked Nelson. And it's quite clever doing that, I think, because at the time, the effects probably wouldn't have let them do a believable transition from one to the other. So, the jump cut makes sense. So we return to MedLab, and we find out that Nelson has actually survived his whole experience, and he's okay. But, unfortunately for Vance, he spilled the beans. And he's revealed that Vance knew the items hadn't been through quarantine, which contradicts what he said before when he claimed that Nelson told him that they had been, but obviously he did actually know that they hadn't been. And as it turns out, he's in it for the money. There's a shock. So Interplanetary Expeditions is basically a front for a bioweapons firm, and Vance was trying to get a better price out of them by verifying that what he got his hands on were actually bioweapons. And he was going to abuse Franklin's expertise in this area to do that. And he didn't really give a damn about how they did it, and didn't really care how Nelson got the goods through quarantine. So he tries to tempt Franklin into coming over to his way of thinking, but unfortunately for him, a pair of security guards are basically already stood behind him because Franklin's already turned him over. So that's the end of Vance. We then cut to Sinclair's quarters, and he's seen better days because he's taken a few solid physical hits from the war machine as well. So he needs a bit of shut eye, and you see his face is bruised. Garibaldi comes in though because he feels that he needs to talk to him, and he says that he was his friend before he was his security chief, basically, and he wants to have a sort of a heart-to-heart because he's worried that Sinclair, having been on the line in the Earth-Minbari War, it has damaged him, basically, and that he's looking to go out in some sort of blaze of glory because he's put his life on the line several times now in the past few months, and Garibaldi feels that's a bit of a pattern. Sinclair says that he doesn't have an answer for what Garibaldi is saying, but he acknowledges the fact that perhaps he should have an answer. So it's interesting because obviously there is this question of whether or not Sinclair is somehow psychologically compromised given what he's been through. We go back to the main corridor of the station then, and Ivanova speaks with Franklin about there being whether or not we might be going down a similar path to what the Akarans went down, basically, because Franklin notes that there's a pro-Earth, anti-alien movement mentioned, which seems curiously familiar. It's, as compared with what's going on in certain countries at the moment. Very prescient sort of conversation, as it often is in Babylon 5 these days. And then some security officers turn up to say that the organic technology needs to go back to Earth for Earth Force to examine, which has both Ivanova and Franklin sort of wondering whether they're just going to repeat the same mistakes as the Akarans did. But there is clearly a push for Earth to get hold of organic tech because it's something that they lack compared with races like the Vaughans and the Minbari. So, it's not perhaps surprising that Earth would want to get their hands on this tech. Interestingly, we finally get to see Sinclair's interview, this piece of it, and it's interesting to know the interviewer has a little floating camera drone just over Sinclair's desk, which of course is technology that we do now have, but it wasn't around at the time when this series was being aired. So again, it's a nice little bit of foreshadowing of future tech there. The question that the reporter asks that we hear is whether or not it's actually worth Earthers being out there and trying to run the Babylon station in the first place. And Sinclair says there are a lot of things that scientists disagree about, but one thing they do all agree on is that eventually the sun will die. It will experience heat death. And he says that unless we go to the stars, everything we are and everything we've experienced will be lost. And that's how the episode comes to an end. Now, this is an arc episode, so everything that happened in this has a little bit more significance than average. And there are a few things that we don't find out, which are hinted at in this episode. So, for example, we don't know who the Akarans were being invaded by 1,000 years ago. Clearly, they felt pushed into making these sort of bioweapons to try and fight back, and the bioweapons, it seems, were actually successful, but obviously they were a little bit too successful. Quite how 11 humanoid machines could actually defeat a full space-based invasionary force, I'm not sure, but that's at the end of the day, we know that they won. So however they did it, they managed it. As I just mentioned, we know that there are gaps in Earth's technological abilities, which people are prepared to pay handsomely to try and fill. And so there is this question of what's now going to happen to that biotechnology. But, I would assume that some of the more militaristic elements of it were destroyed when the Akaran war machine effectively self-destructed. But we know that some things, like data storage device and other elements of it, would have got to Earth. What else? One other interesting thing is that it's quite notable how vulnerable the station is to an attack from the inside, because they were clearly concerned that this thing running amok inside the station could actually destroy the entire station. You can see how that could happen, because obviously its primary weapon was getting more and more powerful as time went on. So I guess if you punch a big enough hole through a spinning station, then it's going to cause serious issues. So there was. It felt like it was quite a reasonable threat in terms of the episode needing to deal with it. And it was also interesting to see the discussion of Sinclair potentially having maybe sort of post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder. It's again, it's quite realistic. So there's quite a few strands going on in this episode, and yeah, I think a lot of people at the time weren't very impressed by this episode. I didn't mind it. I thought it was all right. The thing that I had the biggest problem with, as I said before, is that I didn't really buy the man from U.N.C.L.E. at all. I don't know whether he just didn't want to be there. He felt it was somehow beneath him, or what. I don't know. I guess he was used because he would be a familiar face and a sort of well-known name. But I just didn't particularly like his performance. So special effects makeup again, the current armor was quite impressive. A bit stompy, a bit clunky, but it was okay. So yeah, I think that's about all I've got to say on this one, really. So I'll leave it there, and I will join you for the next one. I mean, I'm running way over my 10-minute mark because I look at how long I've been going for. It's 25 minutes now, so this is taking quite a long time. If you'd rather just have my views on sort of what the episodes are like, that's great. But I think I would quite like to keep on talking at this sort of length about what actually goes on in the episode. Because it means even if you can't watch it at the time, you can kind of be reminded about what goes on in it, and then you've got kind of a self-contained piece, reference point for the episode as a whole. I think this is what this is kind of morphed into from my point of view. So I'll try and keep it around this sort of time for each episode as best I can. Some are busier than others, some may be much shorter than others, and I'll just see how I get on. So I hope you're enjoying them so far, and do leave comments behind. Let me know about the sound quality as well. I'm going to be getting a better microphone shortly because this is a bit Heath Robinson what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm hoping I'll sound a little bit clearer as time goes on. Thanks for listening.